So I'm going to talk a little bit today about hylomorphism, in particular a certain kind of hylomorphic revival that's been happening in various areas of philosophy over the past couple decades. So the project that I myself am most interested in is a project that looks to solve contemporary problems in areas like metaphysics and philosophy of mind using the conceptual resources of hylomorphism, which has been traditionally, and by traditional I mean for the past couple hundred years, relegated to studies in the history of philosophy. So people who study Aristotle, people who study Aquinas and so on have talked about hylomorphism, they've taken it seriously, but largely as something that has historical interest, not as something that contributes to live debates in areas like metaphysics or philosophy of biology or philosophy of mind. People who work in those areas have tended not to take the view seriously for a number of reasons, probably the foremost of which is that they think that the view is unscientific. And so I'm going to say a little bit about that and how we can address that concern and a number of other concerns about the framework, because if we can overcome those obstacles, we see that hylomorphism has rich resources that can contribute in novel ways to solving problems in these areas that I've just mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about the philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind deals in one form or other with mind-body problems. And there are lots of mind-body problems, and there are lots of different kinds of formulations of them, but they have a common architecture. So what mind-body problems have in common is a sense that the physical universe is a vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy that is, or potentially will be, described by our best physics. On the other hand, our ordinary ways of conceiving ourselves, what we are, what we do, our thoughts, our feelings, our experiences, our joys, our successes, these ways of conceiving of things are not formulable using the conceptual tools of physics. The vocabulary of physics makes no mention of thought or feeling or money or success or anything like that. And so initially there's a question, how is it that these central, what we take to be in our day-to-day lives, these central aspects of human experience fit into the world that's described by our best physics? The world which, at least according to a common story, is the world as it is in fact, the world revealed through these scientific methods. So, given that these common principles, here's an example of a mind-body problem. We can just call it the problem of emergence. So, we think, we feel, we perceive, we have conscious experiences and so on, but clearly these kinds of states didn't always exist in the universe. There was a certain time in the universe's history when energy states were too high even to form, stable atomic pairs between electrons and protons. There wasn't even matter. It took a long time for energy to cool into matter, and even longer for that matter to coalesce into beings who could think, feel, perceive, and be aware of themselves. How did that happen? Somebody wants to know, what is it about the states of matter that eventually enabled them to produce or squirt out things like thoughts and feelings? In fact, we might ask how that happens in each of us right now. In the skulls of each of us is an organ that has all sorts of little connections among different components. And we might ask, how is it that these connections, these movements of ions through selectively permeable membranes, give rise to, produce, squirt out, as it were, our feelings, our thoughts, our imaginings, our ideas? So this is one way of putting the problem of emergence. The question of emergence is to say, how does this happen? How is it possible? Because intuitively, it's very difficult to understand how the movements of ions, of tiny particles, could give rise to this rich technicolor experience that we have. Another way of putting the problem, a sharper way, is to formulate it in terms of a number of claims, each of which is plausible on its face, but take these claims together and they entail a contradiction. It's the kind of thing that Aristotle called an aporia, philosophical problem. So, first things first. Beings like us are composed of physical particles. Let's just sort of take that as a stipulated empirical fact of the matter. I'm here, I'm made out of this stuff. This stuff, our science reveals, is built out of littler things. And the same is true of you. Second, somebody might think that the properties of a whole that they're going to be determined by the properties of the little particles that compose it. Why might we think this? Well, somebody might think that we have paradigmatic examples of this kind of lower level determination. So think about mass. You have a mass. You weigh, say, 60 kilograms. Why do you have the mass that you have? The answer, ostensibly, is that you are built out of all these little things, and each of them has a mass, granted a much littler mass, but take all those littler masses and put them together, and they will sum up to your one big mass. So your mass is determined by the masses of the particles that compose you. Think likewise about position. Why is it that my limbs are positioned where they are? Well, one reason is that the particles composing them are positioned where they are. Take these particles, move them up here, and guess what? I'm positioned differently. Same thing with location. What determines my location? Somebody might think that my location is determined by the locations of the particles that compose me. Take these particles, move them over here, and guess what? I have to go with them. So on the basis of examples like this, somebody might think that it's not just the case with mass and position and location, but it's the case with all properties, that all the properties of a whole are determined by the properties of its parts, and all the way down to the smallest parts that something has, the particles that compose it. Now, one thing about those particles, it seems that we've got good empirical reason to think that they're not conscious, that we can describe their behavior exhaustively without ever invoking anything like sensation or perception or thought or feeling. And now, somebody might say, here's the real kicker. Take any number of particles. If they don't compose a conscious whole, adding one particle to their number isn't going to make any difference. One particle is not going to make the difference between something being conscious and something not being conscious. So take some number, n particles. If they don't form a conscious whole, simply adding one more particle to that number isn't going to make any difference. They're still not going to form a conscious whole. If n don't do it, n plus 1 won't do it either. Now, n can be any number you like. It could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 12, it could be 1,000,000. But what this seems to show is that there is no number of particles which don't form a conscious whole such that adding one more is going to make any difference. So if you take this to its logical extreme, it looks like no number of non-conscious particles could coalesce to produce a conscious whole. But now we have these claims, each of which there's some prima facie reason to accept. Jointly, these claims imply that there could never have arisen consciousness in the natural world. But of course, we know that consciousness has emerged in the natural world. We know that it emerges in us right now. And so we have a set of 5 jointly inconsistent claims. These 4 entail that there couldn't be conscious wholes, but our ordinary experience suggests that there can be. And so we have our aporia, we have our philosophical problem. One of these claims has got to go, and the reasoning behind it has got to be flawed. And so we have an example of a mind-body problem. Okay, now, I'm interested in hylomorphism. Hylomorphism, the very basic idea is that some individuals, and paradigmatically here we're talking about living things, are composed of physical materials that have a certain organization or structure or configuration or form, whatever you want to call it. So one simple way of illustrating this is just to use a well-known example. I like to call it the squashing example. So Howard's a real good sport. He volunteers for our thought experiment. What we're going to do with Howard is we're going to put him in a bag, a very strong bag, because of course we want to make sure that nothing leaks out when we squash him with several tons of force. Now there's a difference in the contents of the bag pre-squashing and post-squashing. Pre-squashing, the contents of the bag include one human being. Post-squashing, they include none. Pre-squashing, the contents of the bag can think and feel and perceive and act. Post-squashing, they can't. What makes the difference in the contents of the bag? It's not a difference in the physical materials. Those are exactly the same. That's why we use the really strong bag. None of the materials leaked out. They're all still there. The difference in the contents of the bag is instead the way those materials are organized or structured. And that organization or structure is an ontological principle. That is, it makes a difference to what things there are, one human as opposed to none, for instance. And it's also an explanatory principle. It makes a difference to what things can do, the powers or capacities they have. That's why pre-squashing the contents of the bag can think and feel and perceive, whereas post-squashing, when there's no more structure, they can't. So this is just a simple, intuitive way of trying to understand what hylomorphism is getting at. And of course, there are different ways of hashing out the details, but this is a rough general idea. Now, what hylomorphism provides is an alternative worldview. So you have the worldview that I described earlier, that picture that says the universe is this vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy that's going to be described by our best physics. And there are a lot of assumptions that are built into that and a lot of things that follow from that. And a broad-scale view like that is opposed to another broad-scale view with all sorts of features, and that's the hylomorphic worldview, which says that the universe is not an undifferentiated sea of matter and energy. Sure, there is this sea of matter and energy out there, but it is punctuated here and there with localized pockets of organized change and stability. So the world that we encounter in our day-to-day dealings seems to be a world of this sort. When we find matter and energy, we don't find it just sort of in a raw form. In fact, physicists and other people spend a whole lot of time and effort and money trying to isolate the basic materials that compose everything. Most of the materials as we find them are bound up with structured holes. To try to get at the materials, the raw building blocks of the universe all on their own requires things like large hadron colliders. It requires a lot of stuff to try to isolate those materials. For the most part, say hylomorphists, the materials that we find are worked up into structured holes. Here a human, there a dog, there an oak tree. And so the physical universe isn't this undifferentiated mass of stuff. It's raw materials that are here and there worked up into organized wholes. So we have these two different pictures of what the universe is like, one of which takes structure to be a basic ingredient in what the world has, and the other of which doesn't claim that at all. Now, hylomorphists look at this worldview, and they say, if that's the way you're going to conceive of the natural world, philosophical problems like mind-body problems are inevitable. Here's an example. Consider the way things would look in a world through a hylomorphic lens. So here's a world with structure. We have certain regions of space-time where you have structured individuals like you and I with powers to think and feel and perceive, and then you have zones of space-time that don't have these kinds of capacities. Now suppose you might ask a simple question. Why is it that this region here has thoughts and feelings, but this one doesn't? Why can this do things that this can't? What's the difference? What makes the difference between zone A and its capacities and zone B and its lack of those same capacities? If you have structure as a basic ingredient in the natural world, the answer is very clear. It's because these materials have the right kind of organization or structure. Organization or structure confers on things distinctive powers. It's an explanatory principle. So because this individual has the right kind of organization or structure, it has these distinctive capacities to think and feel and perceive, whereas this individual, since it lacks the relevant kinds of structures, lacks those capacities. Consider now a world without structure. So we ask the same kind of question. Why is it that this zone here is able to think and feel and perceive, whereas this zone isn't? What makes the difference between them? In a world without structure, the answer is far from obvious. And the ways of answering are pretty well constrained in ways that are pretty well rehearsed by now. So one answer, you could say that those powers to think and feel and perceive, that those are really just the powers of the physical materials themselves. That either those physical materials themselves just have those powers, the way panpsychists claim, so little particles do have thoughts and feelings. Or that when we talk of thoughts and feelings, we're really just talking about states of regions of matter and energy. This is the standard physicalist line. So you could claim that the powers are really just powers of the physical materials. You could claim that some regions of space-time just kind of magically squirt out the thoughts and feelings, that it's just a brute matter of law, that some physical things just do this, and there are these brute principles that govern that. So that's the kind of response that's given by emergentists and epiphenomenalists. And finally, you could say that in fact, thoughts and feelings don't exist in the natural world at all. And this is a position that's endorsed both by substance dualists and by eliminative physicalists. People consider these views to be very different, but they're quite cozy together on this point. Eliminative physicalists say that thoughts and feelings don't exist in the natural world because they think that thoughts and feelings don't exist at all. Substance dualists think that thoughts and feelings do exist, but they don't exist in the natural world. They belong to non-physical entities. So they're not part of the natural world. They're part of this non-physical domain. And that's more or less it in terms of the options for explaining why it is, in a world without structure, this kind of an area, this region of space-time will have thoughts and feelings, but this one won't. Now, faced with these kinds of options, a lot of people react the way that the philosopher Miles Bernier did. So, to quote Bernier, Aristotle aims to escape the difficulties of Platonic dualism without relapsing into the crudities of reductive Democritean materialism. Now, just read Descartes for Plato, and for Democritus, J.J.C. Smart, and any sane philosopher will start looking for a credible middle path. A lot of people have had this idea. So, famously, Hilary Putnam and Martha Nussbaum co-authored a paper that was circulated in the late 80s that proposed retrieving Aristotelian insights with an eye to solving mind-body problems. It was an interesting idea. People found it intriguing, but it didn't have much traction within philosophy of mind. The reason is that to make a contribution to an area like philosophy of mind, you have to explain how the theories that you're talking about can actually address and solve the problems that the philosophers are interested in. And it just wasn't clear to working philosophers of mind what Aristotelian hylomorphism had to offer. There were a number of reasons for this. One was the widespread impression that hylomorphism was somehow unscientific, that it had been somehow debunked by the scientific revolution. Another is that there was simply confusion about exactly what hylomorphism claimed, exactly what Aristotle's psychology was. And this confusion was abetted actually by specialists in the field, because it looked like the specialists themselves couldn't agree on exactly what Aristotle's view was. Some claimed Aristotle was a substance dualist, others that he was a dual attribute theorist, that he was a functionalist, a neo-parallelist, some sort of panpsychist. Some claimed that his view was incoherent, and some claimed, perhaps more charitably, that it was a view that waffled between incoherence on the one hand and non-reductive physicalism on the other. And so philosophers of mind, looking at this disagreement among specialists in the field, thought, you know, we're not going to get embroiled in that. We're not going to try to slug through all these texts and get embroiled in all these debates. We're just concerned with our problems. And what they were certainly convinced of was this. According to the specialists, whatever kind of view Aristotle endorsed, it was the same kind of view that contemporary people were endorsing, just under a different label. So why then would anybody take the time to study Aristotle's views when they were convinced by the specialists that whatever view Aristotle held, there was a contemporary version of it already on offer that was, of course, much more clearly formulated. And so Nussbaum and Putnam's idea did not gain much traction in philosophy of mind and related disciplines like philosophy of biology. Things changed in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when developments in metaphysics concerning composition and powers in particular finally enabled people to formulate hylomorphism in a way that could contribute to live debates in fields like philosophy of mind, and philosophy of biology, and metaphysics. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay. So the goal then of the project that I'm most interested in here is in rendering hylomorphism relevant to current debates in fields like metaphysics and philosophy of mind by renovating the vocabulary in which it's formulated. And that comes about by paying attention to the theoretical roles that the terms play. So if you talk about matter, if you talk about substantial form or substantial changes or all these kinds of things, contemporary philosophers, metaphysicians, and so on, they just have no clue. Philosophers of mind, they just get lost. Instead of using those terms, you look at the roles that those terms, the notions, play in the theories themselves. What job does form do within the hylomorphic framework? What job does matter do within the hylomorphic framework? You define those roles, and then you can use whatever terms you like to refer to the things that occupy the roles. Terms that people are going to find less off-putting, more inviting, whatever it happens to be. So, renovating the vocabulary by paying attention to the theoretical roles of things like form and matter. Showing how the things that occupy those roles are empirically respectable, that in point of fact, they're entailed by our best scientific practice. And of course, making it clear that we're not interested in giving the right interpretation of certain kinds of text. We're not interested in getting Aristotle right, or getting Aquinas right, or getting Leibniz right, or figuring out what Merleau-Ponty or some other hylomorphist of the past has said. That we're most concerned with using these conceptual resources to understand the phenomena that interest us. So that's, in outline, the kind of project that I'm interested in. Now, when it comes to carrying out the project, if you look at the roles that the notion of hylomorphic form or structure plays, you can encapsulate those roles using some slogans. So I say, structure matters, structure makes a difference, and structure counts. These are the slogans. To say that structure matters means that it operates as an irreducible ontological principle, that it accounts, at least in part, for what things essentially are. To say that structure makes a difference is to say that it operates as an irreducible explanatory principle, one that accounts, at least in part, for what things can do, for the distinctive powers that they have. And to say that structure counts is to say that it operates as a principle of unity for composite individuals. It explains how it is that many things manage to compose one thing, why you even have a world with composite objects, and how a single composite object can continue to exist, one and the same, through changes in the matter that composes it. How you and I, for instance, are able to persist over time, even though we're constantly exchanging materials with the environment. So these are the roles of hylomorphic form or structure that I'm most interested in here in this talk. There are others as well, and different hylomorphic theories have the notion playing different kinds of roles. But for our purposes here, I'm going to focus just on these, because these are the ones that have the most important bearing on what we're doing. A couple clarifying notes. This notion of structure is not the same as several others that have been floating around in the literature. Structure is a popular term in philosophy. So the notion of structure that's being used here is not the same as the notion of structure that's been used in discussions of grounding and metaphysics. It's not the same as the notion of structure that's been operative in debates about scientific realism. Structural realism in Lady Ross's sense is not the same as structure realism in the hylomorphic sense. It's not the same thing as what Dave Chalmers refers to as structure and dynamics when he's trying to discuss the problems of consciousness. In addition, structure is not a plurality of spatial relations. People, when they hear the term structure, they automatically think of a number of static spatial relations among little bits of things. Even some contemporary hylomorphists have used the term structure in that sense. So David Oderberg, for instance, has this paper, is something like, is Aristotelian form structure? To which he says, no. And the crux of the argument is something like, well, structure is just spatial relations. The thing is, though, I know of no contemporary hylomorphist who uses that term structure to refer to mere spatial relations. It's a straw man that just nobody really endorses that view. And in addition to that, structure is not going to be a sort of thing, an entity in addition to other entities. It's not something that's added to a composite. And I'll maybe touch on the reasons for that a little bit later. But these are just some clarifying notes. Let's put these to one side now and go back to the central worry that a lot of people have about hylomorphism, this vague sense that there's something unscientific about the view. Is that the case? Well, some philosophers, and Marjorie Green here stands out, have noticed that there is a similarity between the notion of hylomorphic form or structure and the notion of organization that's been at work in modern biology. So we can quote her. Eidos, form, structure, functions in a number of striking respects in the same way as the concept of organization in modern biology. The eidos of an entity or process is its organizing principle, the way it works to organize some substrate. Form in nature exists in and only in that which it informs as the organizing principle in an appropriate manner. Eidos, in the sense of organizing principle, is a definitive concept for biological method, though its modern counterpart is couched in different terms. So, just to illustrate Green's point here, her observation, let's take another passage from a popular college-level biology textbook. And I have another version of this presentation where I have a couple dozen quotations from working biologists. These aren't people who know necessarily anything about Aristotle or hylomorphism. They probably never heard of the view. These are people who are simply doing their best to describe living phenomena as they find them. And what Green observed, and what I think we can observe when we look at these things, is that in doing so, they invoke a notion of form, organization, order, structure that corresponds to the hylomorphic one. And this gives us some sense that the notion of hylomorphic form is not dispensable in the way that a lot of people suppose, that it actually is something that's posited by our best science. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So, quote, life is highly organized into a hierarchy of structural levels. Biological order exists at all levels. Atoms are ordered into complex biological molecules. Many of the molecules of life are arranged into minute structures called organelles, which are in turn the components of cells. Cells are in turn subunits of organisms. The organism we recognize as an animal or plant is not a random collection of individual cells, but a multicellular cooperative. With each step upward in the hierarchy of biological order, novel properties emerge that were not present at the simpler levels of organization. A molecule, such as a protein, has attributes not exhibited by any of its component atoms, and a cell is certainly much more than a bag of molecules. If the intricate organization of the human brain is disrupted by a head injury, that organ will cease to function properly. And an organism is a living whole greater than the sum of its parts. We cannot fully explain a higher level of order by breaking it down into its parts. So you notice this passage invokes a number of notions like organization, order, structure, arrangement, and so on. And whatever words you want to use, the important thing is the concept that they express. So whatever order is, whatever organization is, it operates as an ontological principle. It makes a difference to what things there are. To have a cell is not just to have a bag of molecules. It's to have the molecules cooperating in a certain kind of way. It's to have the materials spatially arranged in a certain kind of way. It's to have a certain kind of organization or structure. Likewise, that organization or structure is not just an ontological principle, it's an explanatory one, because on account of something's organization or structure, it has novel properties, according to the passage. Moreover, by disrupting that structure, you disrupt something's capacities. Destroy the organization of the brain, you destroy its capacities. So here, order, organization, whatever it happens to be, is operating as a basic ontological principle and an explanatory one. It's playing at least two of the roles that we have with hylomorphic form. Okay, so again, this kind of a passage is not isolated. If you look at neuroscience, you look at biology, you look at other biological subdisciplines, you find all sorts of talk of order, organization, structure, and so on, which is involved in composing wholes and making them the operative units that they are. But what can the philosopher glean from this? Well, if the philosopher endorses something that I'm calling ontological naturalism, the philosopher can glean a lot. So ontological naturalism says that when it comes to determining what exists, empirical sources, such as the natural and social sciences, are our best guides. So you can think of this as the conjunction of a broadly Quinean thesis about ontological commitment with a broad empiricism. The broadly Quinean thesis says that we are committed to the existence of all of those entities needed to make our best descriptions and explanations of reality true. And the broad empiricism says that those descriptions and explanations come from empirical sources, like the natural and social sciences. So, if we find the natural and social sciences positing organization, form, structure, whatever you want to call it, given our broadly Quinean commitment, we've got good reason to think that there really are such things. We're committed to the existence of those because those things are needed to make our best descriptions and explanations true. So ontological naturalism, this broadly Quinean thesis, is going to make an ontological demand of us. We're going to have to say something about these appeals to organization or structure. The hylomorphic way is not the only way. The hylomorphic way takes these appeals to structure at face value. It says, well, look, I mean, our best scientific descriptions and explanations posit structure that plays the theoretical roles hylomorphic structure does, so we've got good reason to think that that's true, that there really is such a thing. But skeptics might say, well, no, we think that you can exhaustively describe and explain everything without appeal to structure. So there are three kinds of positions of that sort. I'll mention them here just so you're aware of them, and then we'll move on with the mainline hylomorphic view. So one view would say all descriptions and explanations that appeal to structure are just false. When we say that disrupting the organization of the brain is going to disrupt somebody's capacities, that statement is just literally false. It corresponds to nothing in reality. That would be a structure eliminativist. A structure reductivist will say, oh, well, no, it's true. We can admit as true the sentence that disrupting the organization of the brain disrupts capacities. But that's just because organization of the brain refers to something that can be described exhaustively in non-structural terms. So given that that's the case, we can reduce all descriptions and explanations that appeal to structure to descriptions and explanations that make no mention of it. And finally, the non-reductive structure anti-realist says, well, okay, we can't pull off the reduction in all cases, but it's awkward for us to say that appeals to structure are just plain false. So what we can say is this. We treat those appeals to structure as if they are true for certain kinds of practical purposes, because treating them as if they're true is a more efficient way of describing these kinds of systems. And yet, in principle, any such description can be rewritten using terms that don't in any way appeal to organization or structure. So structure talk is a convenient way of talking, but deep down, what makes that talk true, to the extent that we're going to treat it as true, has nothing to do with structure. So Dan Dennett actually endorses a view of this sort when he talks about real patterns, that it's a byproduct of the vocabulary that we use, which is more efficient than using the vocabulary of physics, just less accurate. So those are going to be the alternatives. But again, the mainline hylomorphic view is going to take those appeals to organization or structure in the sciences at face value. And hylomorphists are going to say, by far, this is the simplest way of understanding them. Those explanations in the sciences are successful, and something has to explain their success. By far, the simplest way of explaining the success of structural explanations in the sciences is by saying they correspond to something in reality, by saying there really is such a thing as hylomorphic structure. And so that is the view that I call here just structure realism, and it's the kind of thing that hylomorphists endorse. Okay, so this explains one strategy that a hylomorphist can use for trying to say that there is nothing scientifically suspect about hylomorphic theory. You look at fields like biology, you look at fields like neuroscience, you find that they posit organization or structure in a way that plays the roles that hylomorphic structure is supposed to. And given that those are our best descriptions and explanations of reality, a broadly Quinean view of ontological commitment is going to say, we've got good prima facie reason to think that those entities really exist. Okay. Let me say a little more then about the kinds of things that hylomorphic structures are. So there are different ways that you could go on this. It's going to depend on your basic ontology. Elsewhere, I endorse an ontology that says that there are individuals and properties, and it takes properties to be powers, particularized powers, what are called in the metaphysical literature tropes. But we needn't talk about that in detail. My preferred way of talking about this for a general audience is to say that structures are actually activities and powers, that they are powers that are continuously and essentially manifested. So structure or form or arrangement, whatever term you want to use, those nouns are in some ways misleading. It would be better to speak, to use gerundives like structuring, forming, configuring, because I think that the best hylomorphic view, the one that has the most going for it, is one that understands structure as activity, as the manifestation of a power that things like us have. So I am continuously engaged in configuring the materials that compose me. I inhale oxygen atoms. What do I do with the oxygen atoms I inhale? I catch them up into my metabolic processes. I utilize those to do work in my cells. In doing this, I'm imposing an order on them. It'd be analogous to me picking up a hammer and doing a job with the hammer. I'm just inhaling an oxygen atom, and the things, the tools, the parts of myself that I'm using to manipulate it just happen to be much smaller, and they happen to be inside my skin, whereas the parts that I use to manipulate the hammer aren't. But in principle, I'm doing the same thing. I'm imposing an order on the way the hammer operates. I'm imposing an order on the way the oxygen atom operates. And fundamentally, what I am is an imposer of order on things in the first place, and essentially, I'm imposing my own distinctively human order on the materials that compose me. So this is an activity in which I'm engaged essentially, I say, because if I were to stop configuring these materials, well, I would cease to exist. There would be nobody to do the configuring. And it's, of course, insofar as it's something I do essentially, it's something that I do continuously. This continuous structuring activity is able to explain why you and I persist over time despite changes in the matter composing us. So each of us exchanges materials with the environment, and in doing so, we impose an order on those materials. We make them parts of ourselves. And we take in the oxygen atoms, we eject the carbon dioxide molecules, and so on. And what is continuous about this process is that activity, that each of us is continually engaged in renewing these materials and imposing our order on them as we take them in. So, what sets this kind of a power that we have of configuring things apart is that it's an activity that really can't exist in an unmanifested form the way many powers can. So with some powers, say table salt, the power that the table salt has to dissolve in water might never be manifested. You could isolate that thing for the entire history of the universe so that it never comes into contact with water, say. But hylomorphic structures, or that structuring activity, is something that you can't have just sitting on a shelf. It's something that is always going to be manifested by the thing that's engaged in configuring the materials that compose it. Okay, so far I've been talking about what I call individual making structures. They're the sorts of things that medieval philosophers called substantial forms. They're the kinds of forms or structures that make individuals or substances what they are. But what does any of this have to do with philosophy of mind? Well, it has to do, first of all, the first step is to understand that it's not just individuals or substances that are organized or structured, it's also their activities. So whenever we do what we do, whenever we engage in the activities that we describe in our day-to-day dealings, walking, talking, writing, playing games, whatever it happens to be, these don't involve sort of random physical occurrences. These activities involve physical occurrences, usually paradigmatically physiological changes that have a certain coordination, a certain organization, a certain order. So when I throw a baseball, I am utilizing these parts of myself. Each of these parts has powers of its own. So this part of myself has the power to do this or to do this. When I engage in an activity, like throwing the baseball, I am imposing an order on the way that these parts manifest the powers that they have. I'm coordinating them in a certain kind of way. That coordination that I'm imposing on the way my parts manifest their powers, that's just another form of structuring. That's just another manifestation of my general ability to impose order on things. The same kind of ability that I use to impose a human-like order on these materials, that's an ability that I also express, that I manifest when I throw the baseball. I'm imposing order on these things in this particular kind of way. And so we have structured activities that involve a certain kind of organization or order or hylomorphic structure in addition to the individuals. So this is a form, a kind of structure that makes an activity what it is. And what that organization or structure does is it unifies a number of diverse physical events, the various contractions of this plurality of muscle fibers and neural firings, and it unifies them into a single activity in just the way that my configuring activity, my form or structure, unifies these diverse physical materials into a single individual. So we have not just structured individuals, but also structured activities. And here's where the view, I think, makes a contribution directly to our understanding of thought, feeling, perception, and action, paradigmatically mental phenomena. On the view, thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and so on are just structured activities. They are no different in kind from kicking a football or throwing a baseball or walking or dancing. When I engage in thought, in thinking, in imagining, in feeling, I'm imposing a certain kind of order or coordination on the way parts of myself manifest the powers that they have. When I imagine, walking across the lawn here of Corpus, what I'm doing is I am coordinating the way parts of my nervous system operate. In point of fact, if you were to, there are ways in which you can see this. If you take a PET scan, you can see increased blood flow to various regions of my brain. Functional MRIs reveal a similar kind of thing. You can actually see the coordination that I'm imposing on those parts of myself when I imagine that. When I do sums, when I'm doing the various things that I do, what I am doing is I am coordinating the way parts of myself manifest their powers. I'm doing, in other words, the same thing I do when I throw a baseball. And so, on this view, that's what thoughts and feelings and perceptions are. All of these are coordinated manifestations of the powers of my parts, and in some cases surrounding things. So in throwing a baseball, it's not just a matter of me moving my limbs like this, there's got to be a ball. So I'm imposing order not just on my parts, I'm also imposing order on surrounding materials. Likewise, when I engage in perception, it's not just a matter of me changing the way my neural states operate. Those changes have to be coordinated with something in the environment. Its powers to be seen have to be coordinated with my powers to see it. And so to engage in these activities, though, on the whole, is to impose an order or coordination on various materials, both the ones that compose me and in some cases, ones that are external to me. Okay, now, a few implications of the view. On this view, the behavior of individuals, thoughts, feelings, perceptions, intentional acts, and so on, never violates the laws governing the materials that compose them. This is what distinguishes the view from classic emergentist views, which would say that you get these, the thoughts and the feelings get squirted out by states of matter, and they somehow trump or nullify the powers of physical materials. And that's how they operate in the world. The hylomorphic view isn't on board with that. On the contrary, what it says is unless those lower level physical materials retained all the powers they have, we couldn't recruit them to do the jobs that we need them to do. So just as we can only use bricks and timber to build things because they retain their shapes under compression, likewise, it's only because the atoms and molecules composing me retain the powers that they have that I'm able to recruit them to do jobs within myself, that I'm able to recruit them to generate energy for movement, to generate energy and so on for thought, to compose parts of myself. So the view doesn't imply anything like physical materials squirting out magical powers that then trump or nullify the powers of those materials in turn. In addition, we can also talk about how things like thoughts and feelings are related to the states of our parts. So my preferred term for this is embodiment, that my powers are embodied in my parts, or the powers of my parts. What do we mean by that? Well, think again about the activities, the structured activities in which I engage. So I throw the baseball, and the changes in these physiological subsystems compose my act of throwing the baseball. It's those physiological events with the right kind of coordination that composes that activity. Insofar as all it takes is the right activation of these things, we can say that my power to throw the baseball is embodied in these parts of myself. Likewise, your power to see is embodied in your visual system. Your power to bring oxygenated blood to various parts of your body is embodied in your circulatory system. So on the view that I endorse, all the powers that we have, all the distinctive powers that we have, the ones that set us apart from mere materials, they're nevertheless all embodied essentially in the parts that we have, the materials that compose us. So just as it's impossible for me, not just as a matter of law, but metaphysically impossible for me to throw a baseball without physical things that are disposed in this way, on this view, it's impossible, not just nomologically, but metaphysically impossible for me to think or feel or perceive without certain kinds of physiological subsystems that are disposed and operated in a certain kind of way. So this is an implication of essential embodiment. Let's talk then a little bit about how the view ends up solving a mind-body problem, the one we talked about before, the problem of emergence. So again, one way of formulating the problem of emergence is to request a certain kind of explanation, an explanation of how lower level physical materials are able to produce or generate thoughts and feelings and perceptions and conscious states. The hylomorphist says that is just not a legitimate question. How is it that hylomorphists are able to say this? How do you delegitimize a question? Well, they say, when you ask a question of that sort, when you say, how is it possible that P? That entails that it really is possible that P. That's a legitimate request for an explanation only if there's something that has to be explained. In this case, the possibility that P. What this question is asking, though, it's asking how it's possible for something that's actually impossible. So it asks, how is it that dumb physical interactions get together to produce thoughts and feelings? Hylomorphists say dumb physical interactions don't produce thoughts and feelings at all. This misunderstands what thoughts and feelings are. So again, a thought, a feeling, a perception, an experience, these are going to be structured activities. Think about, again, throwing a baseball. There's no question, you don't ask the question, how is it that the muscles and nerves squirt out the act of throwing a baseball? They don't. Throwing a baseball is something that I do. It's something that I do by imposing an order on the way my parts operate. Likewise, it's not legitimate to ask how the muscles and nerves produce the act. They don't. I produce the act by imposing a certain order on the way my parts operate. Likewise, it's not legitimate to ask, how is it that the states of your brain coalesce to produce thoughts and feelings? Hylomorphism says, the states of my brain don't produce thoughts and feelings. Thinking and feeling is something that I do by imposing a certain order on the way my parts operate. It's just like throwing the baseball. Structural phenomena, structured activities and so on, in general, are not produced by the things that they structure. You don't look at a piano and look at the wood and metal and say, gosh, how is it that the wood and the metal here are squirting out the shape of the piano? That's not the way the shape of the piano is related to the wood and the metal. The wood and the metal aren't squirting it out at all. That shape is something imposed on those materials. And on the hylomorphic view, the same is going to be true of thoughts and feelings. Thoughts and feelings are not byproducts of physical processes. Thoughts and feelings are structured activities that are composed of physiological processes. They're composed of physiological processes with the right kind of organization. And so it's not legitimate to ask how the physiological processes produce the thoughts and the feelings, because they don't. That would be like asking a meteorologist, how does the will of Zeus produce rain? I'm really puzzled by that. The will of Zeus doesn't produce rain. And just as you couldn't claim to debunk modern meteorology by saying it doesn't explain the will of Zeus, you can't have worries about emergence because you can't give an adequate account of how lower level processes produce thoughts and feelings. They don't. That's just not what thoughts and feelings are. So this is the way that hylomorphists go about diffusing this particular problem. Now we had the other version of the problem, the one that presented us with these jointly inconsistent claims. We're familiar with all sorts of other solutions to it. So substance dualists, of course, are going to reject the claim that we're composed of physical materials. Panpsychists are going to say that the little particles that compose us actually have thoughts and feelings just like ours. And of course, the most popular route to go is to reject fore, and so panprotopsychists and emergentists and metaphysicalists are going to say, oh no, there's a way in which you could get particles together to produce thoughts and feelings somehow. But the route that hylomorphists go instead is to reject two. They're going to deny that my properties are all determined by the properties of the particles that compose me. So sure, they might say that properties like mass, properties like location, properties like position, the paradigmatic ones that were used in the argument for two, that those might be determined by the particles that compose me. The reason is that those properties, those characteristics, are ones that don't depend in any way on structure. So think again about the squashing example. The contents of the bag, pre-squashing and post-squashing, they have the same mass. Obviously, the mass of the materials didn't change. Mass doesn't depend in any way on organization or structure. But the hylomorphist says, not all of our properties are like that. In particular, things like thinking and feeling and perceiving, these capacities, they do depend on structure. And that's why they get destroyed in the squashing. So, even though some of our properties might be determined by the properties of the materials composing us, not all of them are. Some of them are determined also by our organization, our structure, our form. To use Aristotle's term, the way Aristotle formulated this, we have natures. We act in various ways on account of our natures. Our natures include both form and matter. Both of those contribute to explanations of what we do. So that's the way the hylomorphist responds to that. Now, the talk was going to go on and talk about various supervenience relations and necessitation relations. Matteo, let me ask you, do you think we have time to cover these?
5-10 minutes if you want.
Okay, I'll go over this briefly. So, one of the things that somebody wants to know when they hear Aristotle's view and think, okay, our nature comprises both form and matter. Some of our behaviors are going to be explained by appeal to our matter. Some of them are going to be explained by appeal to the ways that those materials are formed. How are these related to each other? The way I've described that relation, it's one of essential embodiment. Essential embodiment entails some fairly robust supervenience and necessitation theses. So these are, of course, very technical formulations. Let me try to encapsulate the basic idea. What these say, and these are going to be the strongest ones here, they're going to say that physical twins have to be structural twins. So if you were to arrange physical materials in the ways that they are now, to take them and to distribute them spatially in all the ways that physics can describe, in exactly the way they are here, those materials would have to compose a being exactly like me. So you couldn't have this range of particles that was a structure zombie, say, that in every way resembled a being like me, but that really wasn't. And you couldn't have something that had all these materials arranged spatially in that way and was a structure invert that had all those materials arranged that way and wasn't a human, or human-like, if you think that being a human has a historical component. So if you were to have physical twins, they would have to be structural twins. They would have to be indistinguishable, exactly alike in terms of their activities and capacities as well. Now, some people worry that this somehow would undermine the agency of beings like us, that if you're committed to essential embodiment, if you're going to be a hylomorphist, and you're going to claim that matter is part of our nature, that material conditions actually have a bearing on what we do, that somehow that's going to undermine our autonomy. In point of fact, this is what you might call a conceptual trend that is common to people who endorse that non-structural worldview that I talked about earlier. Because all of them want to accord to physics this hegemonic range and power when it comes to explaining what there is and what it can do. And so the worry is generated by the sense that once you give physical materials any sort of explanatory power, any constraint on what beings like us can think and feel and do, well, then it's just going to take over everything, that there's no extra work for structure to do. So, two things to say here. One, supervenience and necessitation don't entail anything like that view. The assumption behind the worry that necessitation or supervenience undermines the agency, the autonomy of things like us, assumes that somehow, if things supervene or are necessitated by the physical materials, that somehow explains why there are beings like us and why and how we do what we do. But that claim is just false. If you look at the way necessitation claims are actually formulated, they include no such condition. So you have your your necessitation claim over there, and it's just saying that you have any kind of property of one sort, there's got to be another property of this sort, such that whenever you've got the second, you've got the first. It doesn't say that you get the first because you get that second. It doesn't say that having the one is explained by having the other. There just is no such condition built into that. The tendency to think that there is again a byproduct of that worldview which says once physics describes something, it's going to describe everything. But that, of course, is a worldview that hylomorphists reject. And that's the second point to make about this. The idea that somehow supervenience or necessitation would trump or nullify the autonomy and the agency of beings like us simply doesn't take structure seriously. It denies that structure matters. It's just opposed to the hylomorphic worldview. You can do that. You can be opposed to the hylomorphic worldview. You can reject it wholesale in favor of that view of the physical universe as this vast, undifferentiated sea of matter and energy. You can do that, fine. But by doing that, you're not posing an objection to the hylomorphic worldview. You're simply saying, but I endorse a different view of the world. You're not showing that in point of fact the physical materials nullify the autonomy and the agency of beings like us. You're just assuming it from the outset, because what you're saying is, from the outset, form is not part of our nature. Form doesn't make a difference to what we do. On the hylomorphic view, though, it does. If you could give an exhaustive physical description of what's going on here, you are still missing the kinds of forms or structures that I am imposing on these materials. And because of that, your description is going to be incomplete on the hylomorphic view. Because form is an explanatory principle, because it makes an essential contribution to what things are and what they can do, there cannot be a worry on the hylomorphic view that supervenience or necessitation would undermine the autonomy and agency of beings like us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. In 4 questions, we would like to use a rule for which if you have a new question, please raise your hand. If you have a point or a follow-up related to the question that people are talking about, raise your finger. And, okay, I will just take a list. Okay, questions? Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, this was a question. Rob, okay.
Sure. Let's start out. First one. So Bill, I wanted to get clear on what you mean by saying that a form is not a thing. I was a little surprised because you talk about structures exist, right? And then you say that they're powers and activities. And I guess I would have thought that powers and activities were things. They exist, right?
And I guess, want to use the term thing like that, sure.
Well, how would you, so the first question really, first part of the question was, well, what do you mean by thing exactly? What, do you mean just a particular thing? So is the thought that the forms and structures are universals of some kind? Is that the distinction?
No, I don't endorse that. So okay. What I have in mind there, thanks for asking this, because I was hoping that something like this was going to come up. Because it's more of a technical point that has to do with intramural disputes among hylomorphists. So Aristotle has an argument in book Zeta, the Metaphysics, I think it's Zeta 17. It's like 1041b and so on. The Aristotle people, it's the one where he says that forms can't be parts, right? They can't be elements. Does anyone know the exact? It's like 1041b. So Aristotle says, look, if the job of a form is to unify diverse things into one. And if you were to assume at the outset that a form is going to be one of the elements among others, then you would have to say that something has to unify the form with those elements as well. So if we said, we get these things here. And we say, okay, something has to unify these in order for there to be a new entity that's composed of them. And if you want to say, well, form is that thing. So here's form. The problem is that now what we have to do is we have to somehow unify form with those things in turn. Well, what's going to do that? Well, if the job of form is to unify things, then we're going to need something else, another form, to unify that form with these. But now we need to know what's going to unify this form with this form and these things. Well, it looks like we're going to need another form, and we're off on a regress. Now, one way you could stop the regress is by saying, oh, no, it's arbitrarily here. Like, these things just get unified on their own. They don't need some further thing. But then if you're going to stop the regress at any point, you might as well just not even have the regress at all. You might as well say that form isn't some added thing. What you want to say instead, I argue, is that what unifies these things is nothing other than the whole itself. So unifying is something that you yourself do. Now, of course, there are different ways in which we can describe what you do, depending on how we want to divvy up the metaphysical work. We don't say that you unify those things by virtue of being composed of these things, because these things can change. You can swap out the materials composing you. We instead say that you unify these things by virtue of being a formal being, somebody who is a unifier of materials. And that is something that I think is best conceived as an activity that you engage in. The manifestation, the ongoing and essential manifestation of a power that you have. So it's best conceived as an activity, not as some reified thing.
Good. So that sets up my main question actually very well. So I'll give my main question then. So my concern then is whether this form of structure is going to be ontologically prior to the substance, the whole, or not. And
can you maybe clarify what that means? I don't know what.
Well, I just mean, you know, prior in the order of being or something like that, right?
You
don't know what that means.
Rob, I just don't have any clue what that means.
Well, let me just try to fill in what I think it might mean then. So if I have a power or an activity, that's not prior to me, because in order for that particular power or activity to exist, I have to exist, because I'm the one that has the power, exercises the activity. Whereas something like one of my causes, my parents, let's say, those are ontologically prior to me, because they existed first, they did certain things, and now I'm here. They're part of the explanation.
So temporal priority is a version
well,
of temporal priority?
that's an example, right,
Okay.
Obviously. So, but my concern then is that your structure has to be both prior and not prior to the substance.
Yeah,
because,
in different ways, that's right.
no, in the same way, right? That is ontologically prior.
Yeah.
That is, it both explains the existence of the whole and is an activity of the whole. And that I don't understand, I guess.
Well, can you give me an argument that explains why you don't understand it? Like, so for instance, if somebody says, I don't understand that P, typically somebody will say, the reason I don't understand that P is that if you endorse that P, it entails a contradiction. And so because I just can't make sense out of it, we get a philosophical problem. So if there was an argument that said, okay, I have to exist in order for the configuring activity to exist, because I'm the one who's doing it. But of course, I can't, I mean, so is the idea, so let me talk it through this way, and we'll see if you can generate your aporia. So I begin existing exactly with the commencement of this activity in which I'm engaged, namely unifying these materials. Right. I don't exist prior to that. The materials do, right, but they don't form a unified whole. Something happens, usually in the case of normal human development, it happens in utero. These materials end up composing a whole. So now you have a new entity. What is this entity doing? Well, metaphysically, the very first act of that entity is to unify the materials that compose it. It makes those one.
Yeah, so my worry, I guess, is that it's in some sense causing or explaining its own existence. And that violates an assumption that I would make about the asymmetry of such causal or explanatory relations.
In what sense of cause? So, for instance, somebody is a human that comes into existence as a result of the reproductive activity of his or her parents isn't causing his or her own existence. If it were temporally causing, if that were the sense, well then yeah, you get your aporia, because causal relations need temporal pre-existence, but that's not what we're talking about here. So in what sense is there an aporia?
Yeah, so I guess I'd put it this way. Maybe this would help. So for something to do something, right, it must have some sort of power or potentiality that it is exercising, right? And the effect that it produces by exercising that power has got to be disjoint from the power that's being exercised. Right, because it's a consequence of the exercise of that power. It's not part of the power. It's not something that's precondition of the power itself. And so this is why I have a problem with a structure or with a whole structured whole that is in effect bringing itself into existence by unifying its parts.
It does not bring
exercising a power that doesn't yet exist, because the power exists only after, so to speak. So not temporally, but ontologically or in the order of explanation after the exercise.
And I think that if we were to look at that, we would see that the implicit assumption is that the notion of priority that you're appealing to always smuggles in this temporal dimension. So that what you're somehow suggesting is that the thing has to pre-exist. So for instance,
take cases of simultaneous causes, for instance, simultaneous cause and effect, right, where the effect occurs exactly the same moment of the cause. You can still make a distinction of priority there between the cause and the effect, I think.
Sure. Well, you can do that in the case that we're talking about as well.
No, you can't, because you can't say that the whole unifies its parts when the whole doesn't exist until those parts are unified.
Hold on. But see, there's your notion of temporal priority.
Not temporally, not in the temporal sense. But
let's see. So you want to say that we need to be able to distinguish between a power and its manifestation.
Yeah.
Fair enough. You can do that in exactly this case. I am manifesting, I am configuring these materials. Because I am in fact configuring them, I clearly can configure them, I clearly have that power.
Right.
It's just a power that I'm constantly manifesting. You can draw the distinction.
But the manifestation in this case is the unity of those parts, right? But that is the very existence of the whole. And so in this case, you can't distinguish between the whole, the power and the exercise of the power.
Well, I think I just did. Can you explain to me how that entails a contradiction?
Yeah, I tried to.
Saying that I am configuring these materials.
Yes.
And clearly,
You the whole. You the whole.
I can, yes.
Which is something that only exists qua unified, qua
That's
having
right.
these
But
parts
why
unified.
is that a problem?
Then the exercise of the power is included in the description of the power itself.
Well, no. You can say
Presupposed
I have the
by the
power.
description of the power.
I have the power to, well, I mean, there are two things you could say there. One is any description of a power is going to presuppose the description of the manifestation because that's how powers are individual.
But not as an actuality.
The second thing you could say is I have distinguished that. I am continuously configuring these materials, hence I can do that. To talk about my power to do that is just to talk about that. You introduce that modal there, and that's your power.
We have 2 fingers on this. Can we?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay.
I've made my whole.
In short, I'm not seeing that there's an issue here.
This point at least supports Robert Kuhn's, at least historically. It's very important in the Aristotle case that the way that form works is that it's imposed by the parents from outside. They transmit the form, which then does arrive from the father and do the stuff to the matter. Whereas Bill wants it somehow to arise from the very work that it's doing. And how that can be is not clear to you, and I don't think to me either.
No, so Howard, in that case, what you're talking about, the parents are the efficient cause. The parents are the efficient cause of the individual coming about, but I don't want to make it an efficient cause. I don't want to say that I'm the efficient cause in quite that sense. I don't want to say that I bring about, that I pre-existed myself and brought myself into existence.
It's not so much efficient cause I'm talking about as the notion of what the form has to be and where it has to come from to do its job. And so the form does have to pre-exist in this case, just as the form pre-exists in the mind of the carpenter before he makes the table, and he then passes it on to the table. And in all cases of causation in Aristotle, as far as I can see, it's the form, accidental or substantial, comes from somewhere else to do what it does on the matter that it works on. And in your case, you're making the matter that it works on make it in order to make itself, and that looks as if it might be in a bit of a problem.
Well, I think one worry, Howard, about the way you put it is I think you've hypostasized or reified form in exactly the way that I've said with the example of the argument in Metaphysics Zeta that Aristotle shows you can't do. It makes the form something floaty that you can sort of bring in or put out or whatever, and I don't think that's what it is. Anyway, I think I don't
Very
know.
quickly, I think I'm also sharing the puzzlement of Rob and Howard, and I just want to put it differently in case it makes it clearer. So it seems to me that you are taking the manifestation or exercise of the on a view is also the condition for the existence of that very power. And that is the problem. So the exercise is the condition for the existence of the power itself. And that's why it seems puzzling to us. And that doesn't involve any temporal dimension.
Right, so it's a condition for these, it's a necessary condition.
Its manifestation is a necessary condition for the power to exist. And that's where the problem lies, I think.
Okay, so what exactly is the problem then?
That for the power to exist, so the manifestation of the power, the exercise of that power, on your view, is a necessary condition for the existence of the power. And that seems to us, I think, the three of us, logically problematic.
Okay, so let me try to think this through. So the activity exists, the power exists because of the activity?
Yeah, I didn't use
view?
because I wanted to make it as clear as possible that it is the activity or exercise or manifestation of the power that you posit to be also the necessary condition for the existence of that power.
Right, and something can't be necessary.
Its exercise, its operation, is a necessary condition for its existence, and that's what seems puzzling. So
Right.
it's not an explanatory because.
I will grant you this. It is certainly not intuitive, but it may be the case that the theory just has a counterintuitive wrinkle in it. I mean, every theory will.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's more problematic than counterintuitive. It is as if, I'm trying to find an example now that is not philosophical, but like as if the running of the car was a necessary condition for the existence of the car. How do I have it running in the first place? If it's running, it's a condition for its existing.
Right. See, what I keep worrying about with these examples is that they smuggle in this temporal dimension. So the reason why that would be counterintuitive is if it required the existence of the car running before there was a car to begin with.
Well, you see, I didn't use the temporal dimension.
I know. What I'm trying to get at is, in what sense it becomes problematic. So I'm not seeing how any of this entails an actual contradiction. I'm granting that the implications might be counterintuitive, but theories are going to have counterintuitive implications, especially in metaphysics. Everybody's got bullets to fight, because at this level of explanation, the kind of work that we do, it just doesn't have, it's like the kind of thing that physicists, it just doesn't have a bearing on a lot of the everyday stuff. So every theory is going to have counterintuitive implications, and maybe this is one of them of this theory. But I don't see that necessarily as a problem. What I would see as a problem is if there were a way of showing that there were a genuine contradiction. And that's what I'm still trying to get my mind wrapped around. If there's a genuine inconsistency that follows from it, or if it's simply this sense that it just doesn't jibe with our ordinary intuitions, because those intuitions are schooled by mundane examples, that's not necessarily an objection.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that is at least a cost rather than a counterintuitive consequence. It's heavy theoretical cost. It's not just counterintuitive.
Right. No, I'm with you. What I'm trying to understand is what the heavy theoretical cost is. A contradiction would be the heaviest one, right?
Yeah.
But are there ones that are like less heavy that nevertheless are liftable? But are there? I'm just trying to get.
I'm happy to stop here, but the suggestion that you might follow is to think through what the micro steps of activity. What is it for something to be active, to be manifesting, to be exercising? What is it that what are the conditions for something to manifest itself? And you may be thinking that its existence is the minimal condition for something to be able to manifest itself. But the existence of that very thing for you depends on its exercising itself. And that is where it looks like a logical contradiction.
Well, I mean, so the activity has to exist.
But the activity,
it can exist only if the activity exists. That's a trivial
Yeah,
truth,
but you
right?
say that is the activity of the thing, the activity of the whole, the activity of yourself as a human being. You gave us that claim. So,
right, that's right. So what I'm trying to do now is sort of think through. So the activity can exist only if the activity exists. We grant that, okay? Suppose that I just am that activity, though. So, I mean, Peter van Inwagen has this way of talking, that organisms are events. And you can talk about them in that way.
it's just that your
an ongoing
existence,
event.
yeah, your existence, that activity is the manifestation of something that exists only if that activity exists.
Right, I'm with you on that. That's the activity exists if and only if the activity exists. That's where I am here now. But then that's not a problem. In fact, that's a tautology.
I'm happy to start one.
Okay.
One more finger and 5 more questions. There's 5 minutes. If you can keep it order again. It's okay. Okay. So, yeah. Can you please pass the microphone?
Hi, thank you. So it's actually a very, very quick question, so it will be helpful for timing. So just before you came to the final slide, I thought your claim about
you know what? I'm having a little trouble hearing you for some reason. I'm wondering.
Can I just not use this? Maybe.
Maybe hold it a little bit further away from
Okay,
yourself,
cool.
because it just sounds really.
Cool. So just before you came to the, is it okay now?
Yes, this is good.
Just
Thank
before
you
you came to this last slide, I thought that there might be a problem with your solution to the problem of emergence and your claim about physical twins having to be structural twins as well. Then I realized that you actually made this distinction between determination and necessitation, right? So your solution to the problem of emergence is to deny that properties of wholes are determined by the properties of their parts, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So now with that, now with this distinction in mind between determination,
it's not all the properties are.
some of the properties of the. So with this distinction in mind between determination and necessitation. So if we were to formulate the problem of emergence in terms of necessitation, not in terms of determination, would you still reject that premise of the?
Okay, so so let me go back and see how we. I'm trying to understand how we would reformulate it.
Because before you made that distinction,
I see.
I mean, I read you as you were talking about necessitation here, right? So then I realized that actually you had something else in mind.
Okay, so in other words, we place determined by with necessitated by. So it means like the properties as a whole are necessitated by the particles composite. Fair enough. Particles are unconscious. So yeah, in this case, the hylomorph is going to reject a different claim here. It's going to be rejecting like fore.
Okay. So I see. So if you, because
you can get the necessitation. The non-conscious necessitation isn't explanatory or causal or anything like that. It's just correlation. You could say, well, yeah. I mean, obviously, there are certain kinds of physical conditions, microphysical conditions, that are correlated with conscious states. I mean, it's not conscious states aren't correlated with oak stumps, but they are correlated with large brain mammals. And so that since necessitation is just a pattern of property correlation, fore ends up being false. You could say, yeah, sure, there are all sorts of necessitation relations in this case.
Thank you.
Okay,
just a couple of questions of clarification.
Sure.
So for you, is there such a thing as non-hylomorphic structure? Or is all structure hylomorphic? You see what I mean? And in particular, I'm just interested in how you would classify something like music, for example, which you may say is a structured activity, but physically it could be embodied in so many different ways that are completely unrelated, but still be embodying the same thing, if I can put it that way.
Okay, good. So the first one, so the way I want to talk about, the way I'm using the term structure, structure is going to be what unifies diverse things into one. So you get two people, they dance a tango. They don't compose a third thing. There's not some third thing there that's composed of the A and B. Even though they have these patterns of interaction and everything like that, all the agency that you attribute to what's going on there is ultimately reducible to their individual powers.
So in your view, a mountain would not have a structure, for example?
Yeah, that's right. So when it comes to the mountain, when it comes to the table, I think that everything that's going on in this zone right here can be exhaustively described and explained just by describing and explaining the physical particles that are here. They don't compose a unified whole. And so, it's like what Peter Van Inwagen says about these kinds of things. There isn't a table there, a unique individual. There are physical materials that are spatially arranged table-wise. But I want to say, at least the default view is going to be that we're different. We have powers. There's something going on in this zone that's different from the materials. Okay. Now the second one has to do, so music. That's going to have to do with the whatever view that we end up taking on abstracta. So we have, we posit these abstract patterns that can be, realized, and think about rectangles. We talk about rectangles. We posit these things, and there are certain physical things whose dimensions approximate the Euclidean rectangles that we posit, and we say that those things realize the Euclidean rectangle. So what's going to be our take on that? So when it comes to that stuff, I haven't given too much thought to that. What I think I'm inclined to say, though, is what you suggested a second ago, which we can understand this in terms of a structured activity in which we engage. So we engage in manipulating symbols, whether spoken or written, and we do so according to rules. This is a way in which we impose an order on our own behavior. And those rules, which are somehow encoded or embodied in our own practices, we follow them. And so you can think about music, and you can think about logic and mathematics and everything like that we construct in terms of that. At least that's just an initial step, but I haven't thought through the implications of it. I tend to be generally allergic to Platonism, and so because of that, I'd be inclined to. My intuitions would be much more to give an account of that sort. Is that good?
next question is David.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I agreed with you. I thought I was a hylomorphist. Right up until you defined it in terms of downwards imposition of form without upwards explanation of form. I'm going to be saying some things that
explanation, but that's part of the story.
Sure. Well, it just seemed to me there might be a slight tension between endorsing a supervenience thesis, which is like, let's take it as a one-way necessitation relation between fundamental physical properties and spatial relations and things like that, and forms, and yet still insisting that the forms are somehow imposed on all of that structure from above, because the supervenience relation doesn't go the other way. So, I mean, something with this form could have had different fundamental physical properties, could have been very different at the fundamental physical level. So the determination relation is only going upwards, yet somehow we still have to say that the form's imposed from below. So I'm kind of wondering what explains the supervenience. Not whether the supervenience is explanatory, but what explains the fact that we've got this one-way determination relation, if not the fact that the fundamental physics is explaining the form, as well as just necessitating it.
Okay, well, thanks. The explanation of that, so there are maybe two ways of going about explaining the supervenience. So this was a big point that Jack wanted to come in. It's like, you get supervenience, hey, supervenience comes cheap. The real metaphysical question is what explains supervenience when you've got it. You could have supervenience, I mean, with identity entails supervenience. You could have metaphysical correlation, that entails supervenience. Supervenience comes cheap, how do we explain supervenience? One way that people go about trying to explain supervenience is by appeal to a principle like lower law determination. It's because, if you've got this determination relation, that's going to entail the supervenience, even if the supervenience doesn't entail it. But I think that's wrong, obviously, because I reject that. I think that that Aristotle's way of understanding this is the one to go with. So Aristotle talks about this under the heading of hypothetical necessity. And what he says is, in order to have, so his example has to do with things like saws. You're going to have a saw, you're going to have this thing that cuts wood. In order for the saw to cut wood, in order for it to perform its distinctive activity, its ergon, its function, it has to be made out of iron. You try to make it out of rubber, it's not going to be able to do the job. The nature of the activity imposes constraints on the materials that can embody it. So you can have this kind of an activity, thinking, feeling, perceiving, sawing, whatever it happens to be, only if you've got physical materials of the right sort. So that means if these physical conditions are going to be necessary for those kinds of activities to occur, that's going to place constraints on the way the physical universe has to be in order for there to be beings like us who engage in the activities we do. So if you imagine running a film strip of the entire universe from start to finish as it unfolds. At this particular place, at this particular time, we're thinking, we're feeling, we're perceiving. And this is just built into the universe of the hylomorphic. You just have beings like us that populate the universe, that have capacities like we have, and that are exercising them in these ways. In order for there to be a universe that's populated with beings like us, at this time, in this place, doing what we're doing right now, certain physical conditions had to be met. The universe had to unfold at a physical level in a certain kind of way in order for the universe to be this way. And so the universe was constrained to go in that direction physically. So conversely, with Aristotle's view, you also explain things like cognitive deficits. Why is it the case that destroying certain kinds of physiological structures in the brain is going to undermine somebody's capacity? Well, because in order to manifest those capacities, or to have them, certain physiological conditions are necessary. You take away those necessary physiological conditions, you're going to take away the activities and the capacities as well. So does that, and so you can work that into something that entails the supervenience relations. Actually, talk about that in detail. But does that answer the?
Yeah, let me.
Just on this one real quickly, maybe you can explain a little bit more, because I don't see how the hypothetical necessity can explain supervenience, because it's going in the wrong direction. It's saying, given certain structural facts, you must have certain physical facts. But for supervenience, you need the other way around. You need, given certain physical facts, you must have a certain set of corresponding structural facts. And I don't see how the Aristotelian can give us that.
The Supervenience says that you couldn't have a higher level difference without a lower level.
Right.
Right. So if you have these constraints between the higher level conditions and the lower level ones, you'll be able to, you're going to have entailments that say, okay, we can have these higher level activities only if we have these lower level conditions satisfied. So there are going to be worlds in which, if they're exactly the same, that's going to rule out variation in the higher level stuff.
But I mean, what hypothetical necessity requires is that if you have saws in these different situations, then you must have iron, right? But it doesn't tell us that we couldn't have iron in exactly the same form, exactly the same kind, and not have a saw. There's nothing in the Aristotelian necessity story that tells us that, and so that's why you don't get supervenience, I don't think, right? Try that again. So again, you've got a bunch of situations where you have saws, right? And then I want to say no supervenience. So you've got another situation where it's a physical duplicate but no saw. Well, there's nothing there that contradicts Aristotle's hypothetical necessity case, because every case you have a saw, you do have the physical requirements of having a saw.
So let me get this straight. So the idea is that you could have the physical materials arranged saw-wise, but not have the saw.
Right.
Okay, so you can
have exactly. Yes.
So
Why
you
not?
have structures on one well.
Well, that's my question,
Okay,
right? So in other words, it seems to me you've got the burden of proof of explaining why not. Because, I mean, metaphysical correlation is a pretty strong claim, I think, actually.
Fair enough. Okay, so when it comes to the impossibility of structures, obvious and structure inverse, I have nothing to say about that. I have no argument. I would grant that.
But look, suppose I said that
I find the examples absurd, but I do not have an argument that rules them out. I take those as ground level assumptions. So, given that that's the case, if you're not on board with that, if you think that you could have physical materials spatially arranged saw-wise, and yet not have a saw, I mean, there are certain things that are just going to be price of admission to the discussion.
So if I claimed that the mereological facts supervened on the semantic facts in the Bodleian, let's say, and you said that's crazy, Rob. You should say that's crazy. Why would you think that? So in other words, there's no world in which the meteorological facts in Oxford change without some semantic difference in the Bodleian library, right? Well, that would be crazy, right? Because I have no explanation of why these two facts should be connected in this way. But it seems to me that in a similar case, you have no explanation as to why the structural facts and the physical facts should be connected in the sort of way that you're claiming.
Yeah,
and so I think it is. So I think supervenience is a crazy claim in that context.
Sure, it's called essential embodiment. I talk about that. That's what essential embodiment entails. If you think that there are, so in the book, I actually have a proof that takes you from essential embodiment to these claims. And then if you grant the assumptions that there are no structure inverts and structural properties, there is an actual proof that takes you from essential embodiment to these claims.
Right,
now,
but that's the claim I want.
No structure inverts and structures on
Right. And that's a huge claim.
And when it comes to that, I don't have an argument. I can tweak the intuitions, and I can tweak, here's the way I tweak the intuitions. Let's distinguish the case that you're talking about from a case that I do find possible. So you have a demiurgical being who is able to manipulate states of matter and energy, like down to the fine-grained particle level. So what that being does is that being gets physical materials just like these and puts them in this spot. Spatially arrange them just the way they are here. But what the demiurge does is the demiurge, like a puppeteer, moves these particles. So the particles themselves aren't moving autonomously. It's the demiurgical powers that are moving this stuff around. In that case, I don't think that those particles would compose a whole. They would merely mimic what the whole is doing. Now, I don't find that to be implausible. I think that's possible. What I do find just absurd is the idea that you would get the physical particles, that they would be utilizing all the powers that they normally have. And so their manifestation of the powers is exactly the way they are right here, and yet they wouldn't compose a human. That's what I find absurd. So that's why I don't think there are structure zombies, that's why I don't think structure inversion. Again, I don't have an argument to that. I can only tweak the relevant intuitions. For me, that's just ground level. If you're on board with that, then, I mean, you just don't want to pay the price of admission to that conversation. That's fine. But once you do endorse those principles, from essential embodiment, you get peace. And there's a proof in English.
I think we should probably stop here. There's a substance, coffee wisely arranged outside. Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you very much.